The land did not care if a man lived or died. It simply existed, vast and indifferent, a sprawling canvas of cracked hardpan and jagged red rock that stretched all the way to the Dragoon Mountains. The sun was not a warmth here, but a weight, pressing down on the shoulders of the earth with a relentless, blinding force. It bleached the color from the scrub brush and turned the soil into a fine, choking powder that found its way into every seam of clothing and every line of a man's face. Caleb Walker wiped the sweat from his eyes with the back of a leather-gloved hand. He was 32 years old, but the sun and the wind had etched profound lines around his eyes and mouth, making him look a decade older. He sat atop his gelding, a sturdy bay horse named Rusty, and looked out over the northern section of his property. It was poor land, mostly rock and mesquite, with a narrow, struggling creek that ran thin as a silver thread during the long summer months. He had been fixing fence since first light. The wire was old and prone to snapping, and the posts were constantly being gnawed by rot or kicked over by restless cattle. Caleb worked with a mechanical efficiency, his movements slow and deliberate. He stretched the wire, hammered the staple, and moved on. There was no one to talk to, and he had long ago lost the habit of speaking to himself. Silence was the only constant companion Caleb allowed in the main house these days. 5 years ago, the ranch had been different. There had been curtains in the windows and the smell of baking bread drifting out to the corral. There had been Sarah. She had been small, with hair the color of dried wheat and a laugh that seemed to startle the quiet air of the territory. She had died birthing their son, and the boy, small and fragile as a bird, had followed her into the dark earth only 3 days later, taken by a fever that burned hot and fast. Caleb had buried them both on a rise overlooking the creek, beneath the shade of a twisted cottonwood tree. Since then, he had simply gone through the motions of living. He woke up. He worked until his muscles screamed. He ate beans and salt pork from a tin plate, and he slept. He did not go to church, and he rarely went to town unless supplies ran so low that starvation was a genuine threat. The town of Hollow Creek was a 2-day ride to the south, a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled together as if for protection against the sheer size of the emptiness surrounding them. Caleb made the trip 3 days later, his saddlebags light but his mind heavy. Hollow Creek was loud. That was the first thing Caleb always noticed. It was a cacophony of iron rims on stone, the shouting of teamsters, the piano music spilling from the Double Eagle Saloon, and the incessant barking of stray dogs. He tied Rusty to the hitching rail outside the general store and stepped onto the boardwalk, his spurs chiming softly with a sound like dropped coins. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with the smells of coffee beans, leather, and sawdust. Caleb moved through the aisles, gathering a sack of flour, a tin of coffee, and a box of ammunition. He kept his hat pulled low, his eyes on the floorboards, trying to be invisible. But invisibility was hard to come by when the town was gripped by fear. 2 men were standing near the wood-burning stove, though it was far too warm for a fire. One was a sergeant from the nearby fort, his blue uniform dusted with road grime. The other was a cattleman Caleb knew vaguely, a man named Silas Thorne, who ran a spread near the river and possessed a voice that carried like a gunshot. "You hear about the raid near Benson?" Thorne was saying, leaning in close to the soldier. "Took 4 horses and stripped the pantry bare. Didn't kill a soul, though." "That is the strange part." The sergeant spat into the spittoon near his boot. "Nothing strange about it. It is that she-wolf pack, the widows." Caleb paused, his hand hovering over a display of new rope. He had heard the whispers before, but they had always seemed like ghost stories told to frighten children. Thorne shook his head, his face twisting in disgust. "I tell you, it is unnatural. An Apache women's tribe. Just women, roaming these hills like a pack of coyotes. They say they are the ones left over after the army cleared out the canyon strongholds. Widows, mothers who lost their sons. They say they hate white men with a poison in their blood. They are desperate," the sergeant said, dismissing them with a wave of his hand. "And desperation makes them dangerous. But they are just squaws. If we find their camp, It will be a short fight. They are likely starving, eating lizards and roots. Thorne slammed his hand on the counter. They are thieves is what they are. I heard they mutilated a prospector up near the rim. Cut him simply because he was a man. Caleb felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He picked up the rope and walked to the counter, placing his items down. The clerk, a balding man with spectacles, looked at him nervously. "Good to see you." "Walker," the clerk said, his voice too loud in the sudden silence. "Haven't seen you in months." "Just working," Caleb said. His voice was rusty from disuse, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in his chest. "You keep a sharp eye out up north." "Caleb," Thorne called out, turning his attention to the lonely rancher. "Those witches are moving your way. If you see dust, you shoot first. Don't let them get close enough to talk. They are spirits of vengeance, not people." Caleb paid for his goods, counting out the silver dollars slowly. "I don't shoot at what I can't see." "Silas," he said quietly. He took his supplies and walked out, leaving the fear and the bluster behind him. But the words stuck in his mind as he rode back toward the isolation of his ranch. Animals, ghosts, witches. It unsettled him how easily the men in town stripped the humanity from the tribes. Caleb had no love for the violence that had plagued the territory for decades. But he knew what grief did to a person. He knew how it could hollow you out until you were nothing but sharp edges and survival. If these women were out there, alone, mourning their dead, he wondered if they were really so different from him. 2 weeks later, the heat broke, but not in the way a man hoped. The air grew heavy and still, the sky turning a bruised purple over the mountains. The birds stopped singing, and the insects fell silent. It was the calm that preceded violence. Caleb was riding the fence line along the rim of Coyote Canyon, a deep, jagged scar in the earth on the far western edge of his land. The cattle had been restless all morning, lowing and bunching together, sensing the change in the pressure. Caleb pushed his hat back and wiped his forehead. He saw the smoke first. It was not a plume, but a thin wisp, barely visible against the graying sky. It was rising from a cluster of boulders near the canyon edge, a place where the wind had carved out a natural shelter. Caleb pulled Rusty to a halt and dismounted, sliding his Winchester rifle from its scabbard. He moved forward on foot, his boots making no sound on the sand. He was not a soldier, but living alone had taught him caution. When he reached the rocks, the camp was empty. The fire was dead, the ashes cold, but the sign was fresh. Someone had been here within the last day. He knelt, his fingers tracing the outline of a footprint in the dust. It was small, a soft-soled moccasin print, not a boot, and the stride was short. He looked around, scanning the horizon, but the land was empty. Then, something caught his eye, a flash of color near the base of a juniper tree. He walked over and picked it up. It was a leather pouch, no larger than his hand, but the craftsmanship made him hold his breath. It was soft doeskin, tanned to a creamy white, and covered in intricate beadwork. Tiny glass beads in blue, red, and white formed a geometric pattern that looked like mountains, or perhaps lightning. It was beautiful. It was a thing of care and patience, dropped by accident in a moment of haste. Caleb ran his thumb over the beads. This did not belong to a raider or a monster. It belonged to someone who had taken the time to create beauty in a land that offered very little of it. He thought of the sergeant's words. If we find their camp, it will be a short fight. If he rode to the fort and reported this, the soldiers would come. They would track the prince. They would hunt down whoever had sat by this fire. Caleb looked at the pouch, then at the darkening sky. He thought of Sarah's locket, which he kept in a tin box under his bed. He thought of the silence of his own house. With a heavy sigh, he shoved the beaded pouch into the deep pocket of his canvas coat. He would not be the one to bring the soldiers down on them. He turned back to his horse, the guilt sitting in his chest like a stone, though he could not say exactly why he felt it. The storm hit an hour later, and it did not come gently. It began with a drop in temperature that sent a shiver through Caleb's bones. Then the wind came, a howling force that whipped the sagebrush flat against the earth. The sky opened up, and the rain fell in sheets, cold and hard as gravel. The cattle panicked. A bolt of lightning shattered a pine tree on the ridge, the crack of thunder sounding like the earth splitting open. The small herd Caleb had been pushing toward the lower pasture scattered, blindly running toward the steep drop of the canyon. "Yeah, get back!" Caleb shouted, his voice lost in the roar of the wind. He spurred Rusty forward, driving the horse into the teeth of the storm. He had to turn the lead steer, or they would all go over the edge. The rain was blinding, turning the dust into slick, treacherous mud in seconds. Rusty was a good horse, sure-footed and brave, but the ground was giving way. As Caleb cut in front of a terrified heifer, the bank of the dry wash crumbled. Rusty stumbled, his front leg going down into a badger hole hidden by the sudden mud. The horse screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound, and pitched forward. Caleb was thrown clear. He flew through the air, the world spinning in a blur of gray rain and brown earth. He hit the ground hard, his shoulder slamming into a rock, his head snapping back against the hardpan. Pain exploded behind his eyes, a brilliant white flash that drowned out the storm. He rolled, gasping for air, sliding down the muddy slope of the wash. His rifle clattered away. Lost in the brush, he came to rest at the bottom of the slope, half buried in mud. His leg was twisted beneath him, throbbing with a dull, sickening heat. He tried to push himself up, but his head swam, and darkness crowded the edges of his vision. He lay there for a moment, the rain hammering against his face, washing away the blood that trickled from a cut on his forehead. He could hear Rusty whinnying in pain somewhere above him, but the sound seemed very far away. Then, through the curtain of rain, he saw them. They emerged from the storm like spirits conjured by the thunder, shapes moving through the deluge. They were not soldiers, they were not cowboys. Figures wrapped in blankets and buckskin stood on the ridge looking down at him. Caleb blinked, trying to clear his vision. There were 6 of them. They held bows with arrows nocked, and 2 carried old, rust-pitted rifles. Caleb struggled to his elbows, his heart hammering against his ribs. One of the figures slid down the embankment, moving with a fluid grace despite the mud. She was tall, her face painted with a stripe of red ochre across the cheekbones. Her black hair was heavy with rain, braided tightly against her head. She wore a skirt of deerskin and high moccasins that reached her knees. She stopped 5 feet from him, leveling a Henry repeating rifle at his chest. Her eyes were dark, sharp as obsidian, and absolutely unreadable. There was no fear in them, only a cold, calculating assessment. This was Atsa. He did not know her name yet, but he felt the power of her presence instantly. "Who are you?" she demanded. Her English was accented, the words hard and clipped, but clear. Caleb raised his empty hands slowly, wincing as the movement pulled at his injured shoulder. "My name is Walker," he rasped, coughing as the rain ran into his mouth. "Caleb Walker. I am a rancher. I live north of here." The woman did not lower the rifle. "You are a scout," she said. "You come before the bluecoats?" "No," Caleb said, shaking his head. "No soldiers. Just me. My horse fell." She signaled to the others. 2 more women descended the slope. They were younger, their faces tight with anxiety and adrenaline. They moved in on him, patting down his coat, searching for weapons. One of them felt the lump in his pocket. She reached in and pulled out the beaded leather pouch. She held it up, crying out something in the Apache tongue. The sound was sharp, accusatory. The tall woman, Atsa, looked at the pouch, then back at Caleb. Her expression hardened from suspicion to cold fury. "It is ours," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "You stole it." Caleb's stomach dropped. "No," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "I found it. I found it by the rocks. I was keeping it safe." "Liar." Atsa spat. She stepped forward and struck him across the face with the barrel of her rifle. It was not a killing blow, but it was enough to snap his head back and send a fresh wave of dizziness through him. "You track us. You steal from us. You bring the soldiers. Bind him," she ordered the others. Rough hands grabbed his wrists. They used strips of rawhide, tying his hands behind his back with a tightness that cut off the circulation. Caleb tried to struggle, but the pain in his leg and the blow to his head had sapped his strength. He was helpless. He watched through the rain as they scrambled up the slope. He heard a single gunshot, and the whinnying of his horse silenced abruptly. They had put Rusty down. A mercy, he knew, given the broken leg, but it felt like murder in the storm. They returned, leading the few head of cattle that had survived the fall into the canyon. They hauled Caleb to his feet. He cried out as weight went onto his injured leg, but they showed no pity. "Walk," Atsa commanded, shoving him forward. The journey was a blur of misery. The rain never let up, turning the world into a gray, freezing purgatory. Caleb limped, dragged half the time by a rope tied around his waist, the other end held by one of the sturdy ponies the women had been hiding in the brush. They moved fast, sticking to the rockiest ground to hide their tracks. They wound through canyons Caleb had never seen, twisting deeper into the labyrinth of red rock and shadow. As night fell, the rain slowed to a drizzle. They entered a narrow fissure in a canyon wall, a hidden entrance that opened up into a wide, secluded bowl. Caleb raised his head, exhausted and shivering. The village was built directly into the cliff face and the grove of cottonwoods at the canyon floor. It was not a war camp. That was the first thing his fevered mind grasped. There were no rows of warriors checking weapons. There were no large herds of war ponies. Instead, he saw wickiups, brush shelters, huddled against the stone. He saw children peering out from behind leather flaps, their eyes wide and frightened. He saw old women tending smoky fires that hissed in the damp air. He saw a few old men, their backs bent, leaning on sticks. This was a refuge, a place of hiding. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The army the men in town feared. The she-wolves they wanted to slaughter. It was this, a group of starving women and children trying to stay invisible. But his understanding brought no safety. To them, he was the monster. He was the white man who brought death. Atsa rode into the center of the camp, dragging Caleb behind her horse. She stopped and dismounted. The village gathered around. A silent, hostile circle. The firelight flickered on their faces, revealing scars, grief, and a profound, simmering anger. Atsa spoke to an older woman who seemed to hold authority, gesturing to Caleb and then holding up the beaded pouch. The older woman looked at Caleb with eyes that had seen too much death to be shocked by it. She said something in a low voice, shaking her head. "He is a spy," Atsa said in English, making sure Caleb understood. "He will bring the others. We should kill him now." A younger woman shouted from the crowd, her hand resting on a knife at her belt. "Before he talks." Caleb stood swaying, the mud drying on his face, his leg burning. He looked around the circle, meeting their eyes. He saw no mercy there. He saw only the reflection of the violence his own people had inflicted on them. Atsa walked up to him, her knife drawn. She placed the tip of the blade against his throat. He could feel the cold steel and the warmth of her hand. "Not tonight," she said, though her eyes promised violence. "The storm hides the tracks, but gunfire carries. We will decide his fate when the sun returns." She grabbed him by his collar and shoved him toward a small, low wickiup at the edge of the circle. "Throw him in. Tie him to the post. If he moves, cut his throat." Caleb was shoved into the darkness of the shelter. He was forced down into the dirt, his hands retied to the thick central support pole. His legs were bound at the ankles. The flap was dropped, plunging him into blackness. He could hear the women speaking outside, their voices low and tense. He could smell the wet earth and the scent of sage. He leaned his head back against the rough wood of the post. He was cold, he was in pain, and he was alone in the heart of enemy territory. The pouch in his pocket was gone, taken as evidence of his guilt. Caleb Walker closed his eyes, listening to the rain begin to drum softly against the brush roof. He wondered if he would live to see the sunrise, or if he would die here, another ghost in a land already crowded with them. He thought of Sarah, and for the first time in years, the memory did not bring comfort, but a sharp, biting fear that he was about to join her before he had ever figured out how to live again. Outside, the wind howled through the canyon, sounding like a chorus of mourning women. The dawn did not break gently over the canyon. It arrived as a pale, gray bruise spreading across the eastern rim, leaching the warmth from the air. Caleb woke with a gasp, his body jerking against the hard earth before the memory of the storm and the capture flooded back into his mind. His leg throbbed with a dull, heavy rhythm, wrapped tightly in a poultice of pungent herbs and rough linen. He was stiff, cold, and thirsty. He lay still for a long moment, listening. He expected the sounds of a war camp, the sharpening of iron, the shouting of men, the restless stamping of many horses. Instead, the sounds that drifted through the thin brush walls of the wickiup were disarmingly domestic. He heard the rhythmic grinding of stone against stone, likely corn being crushed into meal. He heard the soft, guttural murmur of women's voices rising and falling in conversation, punctuated by the sharp crack of wood breaking for a fire. Somewhere nearby, a baby cried and was quickly hushed. It smelled of home. That was the strangest part. The air carried the scent of burning mesquite, the heavy, earthy smell of boiling beans, and the sharpness of sage. For a man who had lived in the silence of an empty house for 5 years, the sensory overload of a living community was jarring. The flap of the shelter was thrown open, letting in a blast of frigid morning air. Atsa stood there, silhouetted against the gray light. She did not hold a rifle this time, but a heavy piece of driftwood that served as a club hung from her belt. "Get up," she commanded. Caleb struggled to his feet, favoring his bad leg. His hands were still bound behind him, the rawhide biting deep into his wrists. He stepped out into the village, blinking against the light. The canyon floor was a hive of activity. Now that the storm had passed, the women were working with a focused intensity. He saw lines of water jars, clay olas painted with geometric designs, stacked neatly against the red rock wall. He saw strips of venison and rabbit meat hanging on wooden racks to dry in the dry air. Woven baskets sat in the shade of the cottonwoods, filled with piñon nuts and dried berries. This was not a temporary raiding camp. This was a settlement. It was a place where people intended to live, despite the barrenness of the land around them. He was shoved toward the central fire, where a group of women sat on blankets. Atsa took her place among them, standing tall with her arms crossed. Beside her sat an older woman with gray streaking her coarse black hair. Her face was a map of deep wrinkles, her eyes clouded but intelligent. She wore a calico dress that had seen better days, likely traded or taken from a mission years ago. "This is Naomi," Atsa said, gesturing to the older woman. "She speaks your tongue better than I. She will ask, and you will answer. If you lie, the others will have their way with you." Caleb looked at the circle of women. There were no men of fighting age here. He saw 2 old grandfathers sitting in the sun, whittling wood, but they did not look up. This tribe was entirely women and children, a fragment of a people left behind. Naomi looked at Caleb with a gaze that was not unkind, but devoid of pity. "You are the rancher from the north," she said. Her voice was raspy, like dry leaves skittering over rock. "The one who lives alone." "I am," Caleb replied, his throat dry. "My name is Caleb Walker." "We know your name," Naomi said. "We know many things. We know that the soldiers stop at your well to water their horses. We know that you ride the fence lines looking for dust." "I have no love for the soldiers," Caleb said, trying to keep his voice steady. "They water their horses because I cannot stop them. It is the law of the territory." Naomi scoffed, a dry, harsh sound. The law is a piece of paper that says we are wolves to be shot on sight. Tell me, Caleb Walker, why were you tracking us? Who pays you to find our hiding place?" "I was not tracking you," Caleb insisted, frustration rising in his chest. "I told her. I found a pouch. I picked it up. That is all." Atsa stepped forward, her eyes flashing. "He lies. He had the beadwork in his pocket. A man does not carry such a thing unless he has taken it as a trophy or seeks to return it for a reward." Caleb looked from Atsa to Naomi. The younger women around the fire were murmuring, their faces hard. He realized how thin his story sounded. In a land where every encounter between white and Apache ended in blood, the idea that he had simply picked up a lost item out of curiosity seemed absurd. "I have a wife," Caleb said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. He corrected himself quickly. "I had a wife. She died. She liked beautiful things. When I saw the beadwork, I thought of her. It was a moment of weakness. Nothing more." The mention of his dead wife caused a ripple of silence to pass through the group. Grief was a language they all spoke fluently. Naomi studied him, her head tilted to the side. "And the soldiers?" she asked softly. "When will they come looking for you?" "They won't," Caleb said. "I have no family, no hands working for me. It will be weeks before anyone in town notices I am gone. They will think I am just working the range." The women began to argue among themselves in Apache. The tone was heated. Caleb caught gestures toward the canyon entrance, then toward him, then pantomimed motions of a hanging rope. He stood there, the sun beating down on his neck, realizing his life was being weighed on a scale of practicality versus vengeance. One woman, with a scar running from her lip to her chin, pointed aggressively at Caleb and made a slashing motion across her throat. She spoke rapidly, her voice rising in anger. Atsa listened, her face impassive. Then she spoke, her voice cutting through the argument. It was a command, low and final. The other women fell silent, though the scarred woman looked furious. Atsa turned to Caleb. "Some say we should kill you now. Put your head on a stake to warn the others." "And you?" Caleb asked. Atsa stepped close to him. She smelled of wood smoke and rain. "I say that dead men cannot carry water. Dead men cannot dig in the hard earth. You are strong. Caleb Walker, you have hands that know work." Naomi nodded, translating the verdict. "You will live, for now. But you are not a guest. You are a pair of hands. You will work until you drop. And if you try to run, if you try to signal the bluecoats, we will not kill you quickly. We will give you to the women who have lost the most, and they will take a very long time to finish you." They cut the ropes on his wrists, but immediately tied a longer tether to his ankle, securing it to a heavy log that could be dragged but would prevent him from running. "Go," Atsa said, pointing to a pile of empty water jars. "The spring is up the trail. Fill them." And so, Caleb Walker's life as a rancher ended, and his life as a captive began. The work was brutal. The spring was a quarter of a mile up a steep, rocky incline, and the clay jars, when full, weighed as much as a calf. Caleb hauled them back and forth, until the leather strap across his forehead rubbed his skin raw and the muscles in his legs trembled with exhaustion. He was watched constantly. Usually, it was the young boys, children of 10 or 12 who played at being warriors. They sat on the rocks with small bows, tracking his every movement with serious, dark eyes. If he stopped to rest for too long, a stone would skitter near his boot, a reminder that he was property. But as he worked, Caleb watched them too. He saw the way they rationed the water he hauled. Not a drop was wasted. He saw the women sharing meager portions of stew, giving the best cuts of meat to the children and the elders while they ate the broth. He saw the way they repaired their saddles with strips of raw sinew, lacking the proper tools but making do with an ingenuity that commanded respect. They were not the demons Silas Thorne had described in the general store. They were tired, they were hungry, and they were terrified. 3 days into his captivity, Caleb was ordered to repair a section of the corral where they kept their horses. The fence was made of mesquite branches and piled stone, and it had been damaged by a spooked horse during the night. As he worked, weaving new branches into the barrier, a commotion broke out on the far side of the enclosure. One of the women was trying to saddle a roan mare. The horse was young, wild-eyed, and clearly only half broken. She was rearing up, striking out with her front hooves. The woman, who was small and slight, was trying to dodge the hooves while holding onto the lead rope, but she was losing the battle. The mare screamed and lashed out, her hoof catching the woman in the shoulder. The woman cried out and fell back into the dust, dropping the rope. The mare, sensing freedom, began to buck and kick. threatening to smash the other horses and the fence Caleb had just repaired. Two of the young boys ran toward the corral with sticks, shouting, intending to beat the horse into submission. "Stop!" Caleb roared. The authority in his voice froze the boys in their tracks. Even the women near the fire looked up, startled. Caleb dropped the mesquite branch he was holding and limped toward the corral, dragging his log anchor behind him. "Get back," he told the injured woman, keeping his eyes on the horse. He did not shout at the mare. He did not raise his hands. He simply walked toward her, his body language shifting. He hunched his shoulders slightly, making himself smaller, less predatory. He began to make a low, rhythmic sound in his throat, a deep hum that resonated in his chest. The mare rolled her eyes, her ears pinned back, watching him. She snorted and pawed the ground, but she did not strike. "Easy, girl," Caleb murmured, the words meaningless, the tone, everything. "Just the wind. Just the wind and me." He moved slowly, ignoring the pain in his ankle. He stopped 5 feet from her and waited. He didn't look her in the eye. He looked at her shoulder. He waited for her to lower her head. Just an inch. When she did, he took a step. The entire camp had gone silent. The women gathered at the edge of the clearing, watching the white prisoner approach the maddened animal. Caleb reached out a hand, palm open. The mare flinched, but he held steady. He let her smell the sweat and the dirt on his skin. Slowly, agonizingly slowly. He moved his hand to her neck. He began to stroke the coarse hair, his fingers finding the tense muscles and working them with a firm, circular pressure. "There is a burr," he said softly, speaking to the horse but loud enough for the women to hear, "under the saddle blanket. That is why she fights." He reached under the loose cinch and pulled out a wicked, spiny goat-head thorn that had been pressed against the mare's tender skin. He held it up, then tossed it away. The mare let out a long, shuddering breath and lowered her head until her nose touched Caleb's chest. He patted her neck one last time, then picked up the lead rope and handed it to one of the staring boys. "She will ride now," Caleb said, "but check the blanket next time." He turned and walked back to his work on the fence, dragging his log. He did not look at Atsa, but he could feel her eyes on his back, heavy and assessing. That night, the atmosphere around the fire was different. The hostility was still there, thick as the smoke, but the contempt had thinned. He was no longer just a spy. He was a man who knew horses. In the West, that counted for something. Caleb was allowed to sit closer to the warmth that evening, though still outside the main circle. He ate his portion of stew, watery venison with corn, and listened. Naomi sat near him, working a piece of leather with an awl. "You have good hands with the beasts," she said quietly. "I was raising horses before I raised cattle." Caleb replied, "Animals make more sense than people most of the time. They don't hate you for no reason." Naomi let out a short, bitter laugh. "You think we hate you for no reason, Caleb Walker? I think you hate me because I am white," Caleb said. Naomi put down her work. She looked into the fire, her face settling into a mask of ancient sorrow. "We hate you because our world is empty. Look around this circle. Do you see my daughter?" Caleb looked. "No, she was taken," Naomi said, her voice flat. "2 winters ago. The soldiers came to the agency where we were trying to live in peace. They said the children must go to school, to learn to be civilized, to learn to pray to your Jesus. They put her in a wagon with the others. She screamed for me until the wagon was gone. I have not seen her since. They say she has a new name now, Mary, or Susan, a white name for a white life." She gestured across the fire to a woman with short-cropped hair, a sign of mourning. "That is Ilta. Her husband was shot by ranchers while he was hunting. They said he was stealing cattle. He had only a bow and arrow. They cut off his hands and nailed them to a fence post. And Atsa?" Caleb asked, his gaze drifting to the tall leader who sat sharpening a knife on a whetstone. Naomi sighed. "Atsa had a brother. He was young, full of fire. He rode with Geronimo for a time. When he surrendered, they promised him safety. They put him in chains and sent him to a place called Florida. He died of the coughing sickness in a stone cell. far from the red earth. Atsa says his spirit cannot find its way home because the land there is too strange. Caleb looked down at his own rough hands. He thought of the empty crib he had built for his son, the one that now sat gathering dust in the back room of his ranch house. "I am sorry," Caleb whispered. Naomi looked at him sharply. "Your sorry does not bring them back." "No," Caleb said. "It doesn't. My wife, Sarah, she died birthing our son. The boy lived 3 days. I held him while he burned up with fever. I prayed to that Jesus you talked about. I begged, but the room just stayed quiet. And when he died, I dug the hole myself." He looked up, meeting Naomi's eyes. "I don't know your pain, Naomi." "But I know what it is to look at a horizon and see nothing but empty space where people used to be." Naomi held his gaze for a long time. The fire crackled, sending sparks drifting up toward the stars. "You are a ghost too," she said softly. "You walk and you work, but your spirit is half in the ground." Caleb nodded slowly. Maybe it was a small bridge, fragile as a spider web. But it was there. A week later, the heat returned with a vengeance. The canyon turned into an oven. The small herd of cattle the women had stolen, about 20 head, was penned in a box canyon nearby, where the grazing was meager. Caleb was sent to help water them. When he arrived at the pen, he frowned. The cattle were gaunt, their ribs showing through their dusty hides. They stood with their heads low, listless. He walked among them, checking their eyes and their tongues. Atsa watched him from her horse, her rifle resting across her saddle. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "These cows are sick," Caleb said bluntly. He pointed to a steer. "That one has bloat. And they are all starving. This grass is too dry, and the water here is muddy. If you keep them here another week, half of them will be dead. Then you have no meat for the winter." Atsa stiffened. "This is the only safe place. If we move them to the open range, the ranchers will see." "They don't need open range," Caleb said. "They need better grass and shade. And I suppose you know a place?" Atsa asked, her voice dripping with suspicion. "A place where you can lead us into a trap?" Caleb wiped his forehead. "I know a valley. It is about 4 hours' ride from here. It is hidden. High walls. Good water. It is on the edge of my land, but I never graze it because the trail is too rough for a big herd. But for 20 head, we could get them there." Atsa stared at him. Her dark eyes searched his face, looking for the lie. She looked for the twitch of deceit, the nervousness of a man plotting betrayal. Caleb stood his ground. He was not offering this to save his own skin. He was offering it because he was a rancher, and seeing animals suffer went against his grain, and perhaps because he wanted to help these women survive. "If you lead us to soldiers," Atsa said, her voice quiet and deadly, "I will cut your heart out while you still breathe." "I know," Caleb said. "We will go tonight," Atsa decided. "We will take 5 cows. If the place is good, we take the rest. If it is a trap, only I die. And you." The ride was tense. They moved under the cover of a moonless sky, the horses picking their way over loose shale and rock. Caleb rode a spare pony, his feet tied beneath the animal's belly. Atsa rode beside him, her knee brushing his, her hand never far from her knife. When they reached the valley, the sun was just beginning to touch the highest peaks. It was a hidden jewel, a bowl of green grass fed by a spring that came straight out of the rock. Cottonwoods provided deep shade. It was invisible from the plains below. Atsa rode into the grass. The cattle immediately lowered their heads and began to tear at the lush feed. The tension in Atsa's shoulders dropped. She looked around, her expression softening into something like wonder. "It is good," she admitted. They watered the horses and sat by the spring to rest before the ride back. The air here was cool and sweet. Atsa stood near the water, washing the dust from her face. She looked at Caleb, who was sitting on a rock, rubbing his bound legs. "Why?" she asked. "Why help us? You are a white man. These are stolen cows. They probably belong to your friends." "I don't have many friends," Caleb said, "and cattle are just cattle. They don't deserve to starve because men are fighting." Atsa walked over to him. She towered over him as he sat. She was a striking woman, fierce, scarred and strong. In the early light, he could see the fatigue etched around her eyes, the burden of leading a dying people. "You are a strange enemy." "Caleb Walker," she said. "I am tired of being an enemy," Caleb replied. Atsa crouched down so they were eye to level. The movement brought her close, invading his personal space. He could see the golden flecks in her dark eyes. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin. "Do not think this makes us friends," she whispered. Her voice was husky. "If the soldiers come, if I think you have signaled them, I will kill you. I will not hesitate." Caleb looked at her. He saw the threat. Yes, but beneath it, he saw a desperate need to protect what was hers. He felt a sudden, unexpected pull in his chest, a tightening that had nothing to do with fear. He respected her. He respected the way she stood between her people and the end of the world. And for the first time in 5 years, he felt a flicker of something else, a warmth, a desire to reach out and touch the braid that rested on her shoulder. It terrified him more than her knife. "I believe you," Caleb said, his voice rough. "I won't give you a reason." Atsa held his gaze for a second longer than necessary. Her lips parted slightly, as if she were going to say something else. Then she stood up abruptly, breaking the spell. "We go back," she said sharply. "We must move the rest of the herd before the moon rises." The weeks turned into a month. Caleb's hands grew harder, his skin darker from the sun. The ankle rope was replaced by a simple warning. He worked from dawn until dusk, but the nature of his captivity shifted. He was no longer invisible. One afternoon, he was sitting in the shade, knotting a new lead rope for a halter. He was tying a complex diamond knot, his fingers moving with practiced speed. He felt a presence and looked up. A girl of about 14 stood there. She was lanky and awkward, with eyes that were too big for her face. She had been watching him for days. She pointed to the rope. "How?" she asked in English. Caleb paused. He held up the rope. "It is a diamond knot," he said, "keeps the end from fraying." He undid it slowly, like this, over, under, through the loop. The girl hesitated, then stepped closer. She held out a piece of rawhide she had been twisting. "Show me?" she asked shyly. Caleb moved over on the log, leaving space. "Sit," he said. She sat. For the next hour, they did not speak of war or loss. They spoke in the language of loops and tension. When she finally pulled the knot tight and saw the perfect shape form, her face lit up with a brilliant, white-toothed smile. "Good," Caleb said, nodding. "That is good." Later that evening, as he went to his shelter, he found a small woven cloth on his blanket. Inside was a piece of honeycomb, sweet and golden, a rare treat in the desert. He looked around, but the girl was gone. He sat in the dark, eating the honey, feeling the sweetness dissolve on his tongue. He knew the layout of the canyon now. He knew where the guards slept. He knew which horses were fast. He could probably escape if he chose the right night, if he was willing to risk a bullet in the back. But as he licked the honey from his fingers, Caleb realized with a start that he wasn't planning his escape. He was thinking about the irrigation ditch that needed digging tomorrow. He was thinking about the mare's hoof that needed trimming. He was thinking about the way the firelight caught the sharp angles of Atsa's face. He was a prisoner. Yes, but for the first time since Sarah died, he was needed. And that, he discovered, was a harder chain to break than any rope. The ascent to the hidden valley was not a path meant for cattle, and barely one meant for horses. It was a goat trail, a jagged scar of loose shale and limestone that wound its way up the spine of the ridge before dipping into the high country. The sun was a white hammer against the anvil of the earth, pounding down on the small caravan until the heat waves shimmied off the rocks like water. Caleb rode point. He was not tied this time, a fact that sat heavily in the air between him and the women behind him. He rode a piebald mare with the uncertain gait, his eyes scanning the treacherous footing ahead. Behind him rode Atsa, her rifle resting across her thighs, her gaze fixed not on the trail, but on the back of his canvas coat. Behind her came Naomi and 3 other women, driving the small test herd of 20 cattle. The cattle were unhappy. They bawled and scrambled. their hooves clattering on the stone. It was dangerous work. One wrong step from a steer could trigger a slide that would sweep them all into the ravine 500 feet below. "Easy," Caleb murmured, patting the mare's neck. He turned in the saddle, looking back. "Keep them tight against the wall. The shale is loose on the edge." Atsa nodded once, her face a mask of dust and concentration. She did not trust him yet. He knew. She was waiting for him to kick his horse into a gallop, to vanish around a bend and make for the fort. Every time the trail widened, he could feel her tension rise, her fingers tightening on the stock of her Winchester. But Caleb did not run. He watched the ground. About 2 hours into the climb, the trail narrowed at a place called Devil's Elbow. The rock hung low overhead, forcing the riders to hunch down, while the path crumbled away on the right side into a sheer drop. A young heifer, spooked by the shadow of a hawk passing overhead, balked. She twisted, her hind legs slipping over the edge. She scrambled frantically, stones cascading down the cliff face with a sound like dry bones rattling. The heifer panicked, thrashing, threatening to pull the horse behind her, ridden by a young woman named Connie, over the edge with her. Connie shouted, her pony rearing in the tight space. "Hold!" Caleb roared. He did not think. He swung his leg over the saddle and dropped to the ground, ignoring the flare of pain in his healing ankle. He threw his reins to the ground and lunged past Atsa's horse. He grabbed the heifer by the tail and the flank, digging his boot heels into the gravel. "Heave!" he grunted, the veins in his neck standing out. It was a foolish thing to do. A falling cow could easily drag a man to his death, but Caleb leaned back, using his weight as a counterbalance. Connie whipped her pony forward, clearing the danger zone. Atsa was off her horse in a second, grabbing the heifer's horns. Together, man and woman, white and Apache, they wrestled the terrifying weight of the animal. For a heartbeat, they hung suspended between the rock and the void. Then, with a final, desperate scramble, the heifer found purchase and lunged back onto the trail, trembling and blowing snot. Caleb fell back against the rock wall, his chest heaving. Atsa stood over him, breathing hard. Her braid had come loose, a strand of black hair sticking to her sweat-dampened cheek. She looked at the heifer, then at the drop, and finally at him. "You are a fool," she said. Her voice was rough, but the lethal coldness was gone. "You could have fallen. Better a cow than the girl." Caleb wheezed, wiping his dirty hands on his trousers. Atsa stared at him for a long moment. He expected a reprimand, or perhaps silence. Instead, she reached out and briefly gripped his shoulder. It was a warrior's gesture, firm and acknowledging. "Ride," she commanded, turning back to her horse. "We lose the light." When they finally crested the ridge and descended into the bowl of the valley, the change was miraculous. The harsh red rock gave way to a soft, rolling expanse of green. It was a box canyon, fed by a spring that bubbled up from deep underground, ensuring the grass grew knee-high even in the heat of summer. High, natural rock walls enclosed it on 3 sides, creating a fortress that required no guards. The women stopped their horses. The silence of the valley was different from the silence of the desert. It was the silence of peace, broken only by the wind in the cottonwoods and the call of a mourning dove. Caleb watched them. He saw the tension drain out of their bodies like water from a cracked jar. Naomi closed her eyes and tilted her face to the sky, whispering a prayer. Connie, the girl who had almost fallen, laughed, a bright, startled sound, and pointed at the water. The cattle did not need to be driven. They smelled the water and the sweet grass and trotted forward, spreading out to graze with an eagerness that made Caleb's chest ache with a strange satisfaction. "We made it," he said quietly. Atsa rode up beside him. She looked out over the valley, her eyes scanning the rim, checking for threats out of habit. But there were none. "It is good land," she admitted. She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "Why did you never bring your own herd here?" Caleb shrugged, looking down at his saddle horn. "Too far from the house, and it felt like a place that wanted to be left alone." Atsa did not answer, but she watched him as he dismounted to check the horses. She was wondering. He realized, if the spirits were playing a trick on her, how could the enemy, the white rancher, be the one to lead them to sanctuary? They made camp near the spring, under the shelter of a grove of ancient oaks. The sun began to set, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and violet. Caleb was loosening the cinch on the pack mule when his hand slipped. A rusted buckle caught the meat of his palm, slicing a deep gash across the base of his thumb. He hissed through his teeth, instinctively clutching the hand to his chest to stop the blood. "Let me see." Atsa was there before he could wrap it. She did not ask permission. She took his wrist in her hand. Her fingers were calloused from bowstrings and reins, but her touch was surprisingly gentle. She examined the cut with a clinical eye. "It is deep," she said. "Sit." Caleb sat on a flat rock. Atsa knelt before him. She pulled a small pouch from her belt and took out a pinch of dried yarrow powder, packing it into the wound to stop the bleeding. The sting was sharp, and Caleb flinched. "Hold still," she murmured. She tore a strip of cloth from her own hem and began to bind his hand. As she worked, her head was bent low. Caleb looked at the part in her hair, the curve of her neck where the skin was a warm copper color. He could smell the sage she used to wash her clothes, and the scent of the horse, and something that was just her, a scent of earth and rain. She finished the knot and looked up. She found him watching her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Her hand was still holding his. The contact was practical, medical, yet it felt as if a current was running from her skin to his. He saw the flecks of gold in her irises. He saw the small scar above her eyebrow. He saw a woman, not a captor, not a symbol of the wild, but a woman who was tired and strong and beautiful in a way that made his throat tight. The air between them grew thick. Caleb felt a sudden, terrifying urge to lean forward, to close the distance. He saw her breath hitch, her lips parting slightly. Then she pulled her hand away as if burned. She stood up abruptly, smoothing her skirt. "Keep it clean," she said, her voice tight. "If it festers, you cannot work." "I will," Caleb said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "Thank you." She turned and walked quickly toward the fire, leaving him sitting on the rock with his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. That night, the cold settled into the valley, sharp and clear. The Milky Way was a river of spilled milk across the black sky. The women sat around a low fire, the flames reflecting in their dark eyes. They spoke in Apache, their voices low and rhythmic. Caleb sat on the periphery, whittling a piece of oak. He did not ask to join the circle, but he did not leave it either. He caught fragments of their conversation, translated by the weeks of immersion and Naomi's occasional lessons. Jali, money, two, water. Ishkin, boy. He heard the word ni, earth, spoken with reverence. Naomi shifted on her blanket and looked at him. The firelight deepened the canyons of wrinkles on her face. "Caleb Walker," she said. "The others are asking about you." Caleb stopped whittling. "What do they ask?" "They ask what a man does when he is alone in a house of ghosts." Naomi said, "They ask why you stayed on that ranch when the land clearly wanted you gone." Caleb looked into the fire. A log snapped, sending a shower of sparks upward. "I stayed because I had nowhere else to go," he said honestly. "The ranch. It was what we built, me and Sarah. Leaving it felt like leaving her behind." "And now?" Naomi asked. "You are here. You are not on the ranch. Do you still feel her there?" Caleb thought about the empty rooms, the silence that rang in his ears. "No," he said softly. "I think she left a long time ago. I think I was just guarding the dust." The women fell silent, even the younger ones, who usually looked at him with suspicion, were listening. Naomi leaned forward. "So, what do you want? If the soldiers did not kill us, if you were free to walk away tomorrow, what would you seek? Gold? A new wife? A city with stone streets?" Caleb looked up at the stars. He felt a great, yawning emptiness inside him. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a bottomless pit. It felt like a cleared field, waiting for seed. "I don't know," he admitted. His voice was raspy. "I don't care about gold. I don't care about cities. I think I just want to wake up in the morning and feel like there is a reason to get out of bed. I am tired of living like a ghost. Naomi, I am tired of being dead while my heart is still beating." Naomi nodded slowly. She said something in Apache to the others. The women murmured in agreement. Atsa was watching him across the fire. Her face was shadowed, but her eyes were bright. She did not speak, but she did not look away. In her gaze, Caleb saw a flicker of recognition. She knew what it was to be a ghost. She knew what it was to survive your own life. The peace of the valley was shattered 2 days after they returned to the main canyon. It began with the sound of a horse being ridden hard. A scout, a lithe girl named Elu, who could ride bareback better than most men could in a saddle, came thundering into the village. Her horse was lathered, its sides heaving. "Soldiers!" she shouted, sliding from the horse before it had fully stopped. Soldiers and men in long coats. Atsa was there in an instant, grabbing the girl by the shoulders. "Where?" "Near the ranch." Elu gasped. "The ranch of the white man. They are at the well." Caleb, who had been repairing a bridle near the water jars, stood up. A cold dread washed over him. "What are they doing?" Atsa demanded. "They are looking at the tracks," Elu said. "They found the broken gate. They are asking the wind where the cattle have gone. I heard them. One of them, a man with a red beard. He said the Apache have taken the rancher. He said they will hunt them down and hang them all." The village erupted. The calm domesticity vanished in a second, replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of fear. Women grabbed their children. Old men reached for their walking sticks. They turned on Caleb. The eyes that had begun to soften were now hard as flint again. He was the source of this. He was the magnet drawing the iron of the army down upon them. "Kill him!" a woman screamed. "Kill him and leave his body on the trail. Maybe they will stop if they find him." "No!" shouted another. "They will kill us anyway. We must run!" Naomi stood up, raising her hands for silence, but the fear was too loud. The argument spiraled into a chaotic shouting match. "He led them here. He is a trap. We should have cut his throat the first night." Caleb stood still. He did not run. He knew that if he ran, he would be dead before he took 10 steps. He looked for Atsa. She was standing in the center of the storm, her face unreadable. She listened to the cries for his blood. She saw the panic in the eyes of her sisters. Finally, she stepped forward. Silence. Her voice cracked like a whip. The shouting died down to a sullen murmur. Atsa walked over to Caleb. She stopped arm's length from him. She looked at him with a gaze that stripped him bare. "Is this what you planned?" she asked quietly. "No," Caleb said. "You know it isn't." "Do I?" she asked. A woman pushed through the crowd. It was the one with the scar, the one who had demanded his death on the first day. She was shaking with rage. "He is death!" she shrieked. She lunged at Caleb. She had a knife in her hand, a rusted butcher knife with a wicked edge. She moved fast, fueled by a grief that had never healed. Caleb saw the flash of steel. He twisted, bringing his forearm up to block the blow. The knife slashed his sleeve, drawing a thin line of blood on his arm. But he did not strike back. He caught her wrist, holding it firm, not twisting, just stopping the violence. "I am not your enemy," he said, his voice low and urgent. The woman screamed, spitting in his face, thrashing against his grip. "My brother is dead because of men like you." Atsa moved. She did not shout. She simply stepped in, grabbed the woman's wrist with a grip of iron, and forced the knife from her hand. It clattered to the stones. "Enough." Atsa shoved the woman back, not gently. She turned to the circle of women. Her chest was heaving, her eyes blazing with a fierce, terrifying light. "Look at us," she shouted, gesturing at the woman she had just disarmed. "We are Apache. We are the people. Are we now coyotes who turn on each other because we smell fear?" She pointed at Caleb. "Yes, he is white. Yes, his face is the face of the men who killed our families. But look at his hands. They are covered in our dirt. He watered your horses. He saved Connie from the cliff. He gave us the valley." She lowered her voice, but it carried to every corner of the canyon. "To kill him now, because we are afraid. That is the way of the soldiers. That is the way of cowards. I will not lead a tribe of cowards. If we die standing. We do not spill blood to buy safety." The silence that followed was absolute. The woman who had attacked Caleb sank to her knees, weeping into her hands. Atsa turned back to Caleb. Her anger was still there, vibrating in the air. But her eyes, when they met his, were full of something else. It was a desperate plea for him to be worth the risk she was taking. It was a challenge. "Do not make me a fool," her eyes said. "Go to the rim," she told him. "Watch for dust. If you see them coming, you tell us." "I will," Caleb said. That evening, the camp was somber. The threat of the soldiers hung over them like a thunderhead. Caleb took his post on a high ledge overlooking the southern approach. The wind was picking up, blowing cold from the mountains. He heard the soft scuff of a moccasin on stone. He did not turn. He knew who it was. Atsa sat down on the rock beside him. She did not look at him. She looked out at the darkening desert. "They will come," she said. "Maybe not tomorrow, but they will come. I know," Caleb said. "Why did you not let her cut you?" Atsa asked. "You are strong. You could have broken her arm. She was hurting," Caleb said. "You don't hit a horse when it's scared. You don't hit a person when they're grieving." Atsa let out a long, shaky breath. "You are a strange man. Caleb Walker." She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders. The wind whipped a loose strand of hair across her face. "When I was a girl," she said, her voice distant, "soldiers came to our winter village. They carried a white flag. They had food. They smiled. My father went out to meet them." He shook their hands. She paused, swallowing hard. Then the leader dropped his hand, and the shooting started. They did not stop until the snow was red. They laughed while they did it. Caleb closed his eyes. He felt a wave of nausea. He knew those stories. He knew the men who told them in saloons, bragging about their victories. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "It is not enough. But I am sorry." Atsa turned to look at him. The moonlight washed the color from her face, leaving her looking like a statue carved from sorrow. "Why did you bury your heart?" "Caleb," she asked, "you told Naomi you were a ghost. Why?" Caleb looked at his hands. He thought of the tiny coffin he had built. He thought of the silence. "Because it hurt too much to keep it beating," he said. "When Sarah died, she took the future with her. I looked at the world, and all I saw was what I had lost. It was easier to just stop feeling. If you don't hope, you can't be disappointed." Atsa nodded. "I know this. I have turned my heart to stone so I could lead these women. If I cried for every loss, I would have drowned long ago." "But," Caleb said, turning to face her, "the stone is cracking." "Atsa." They were close now. Very close. The wind howled around them, but in the small space between their bodies, the air was still and charged with a terrifying heat. Caleb looked at her mouth. He saw the tremble in her lower lip. He saw the way her breath hitched in her throat. He wanted her. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He didn't just want her body. He wanted the fire that burned inside her. He wanted to stand between her and the world. Atsa lifted her hand. She reached out, her fingers hovering inches from his face. She wanted to touch the stubble on his jaw. She wanted to know if he was real, if this fragile connection was strong enough to hold the weight of their two worlds. Her hand trembled. Caleb stopped breathing. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to lean in, to close the gap, to press his mouth to hers and let the rest of the world burn. But he didn't. He saw the fear in her eyes, warring with the desire. He saw the weight of the tribe on her shoulders. If he touched her now, if they crossed that line, there would be no going back. It would change everything. It might destroy the fragile trust he had just earned with the others. He stayed still, his eyes locked on hers, offering her the choice. Atsa's fingers curled into a fist. She pulled her hand back, slowly, reluctantly. She let out a breath that sounded like a sob. "We cannot," she whispered. "No," Caleb rasped. "Not yet." She stood up, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. She looked at him one last time, her eyes dark with a hunger that matched his own. "Watch the south," she said, her voice breaking. She turned and fled back down the trail toward the village, leaving Caleb alone on the rim, shivering in the cold wind, his heart beating harder than it had in 5 years. He was alive again, and it terrified him. The news arrived with the dust of the afternoon wind, carried by a scout named Elu who had been watching the roads to the south. She slid from her horse near the central fire, her face streaked with sweat and grim purpose, and spoke rapidly to Atsa and Naomi. The women gathered close, their shawls pulled tight against the chill, their faces hardening as the words spilled out. Caleb stood near the woodpile, axe in hand, waiting. He did not need to speak Apache to understand the tone of impending violence. Atsa broke from the circle and walked toward him. Her stride was stiff, her jaw set in a line of granite. "They are coming," she said flatly. "Who?" Caleb asked, resting the axe head in the dirt. "Men from the town," Atsa said, "and men from the ranches near the river. Elu says there are 30 of them, maybe more. They ride with a lawman who wears a star. They are not just looking for cattle, Caleb. They are looking for blood. They say they are coming to sweep the canyons clean." Caleb felt a cold stone settle in his gut. 30 men. A posse that size was not a hunting party, it was a war band. Did she hear names? Caleb asked. Atsa nodded. She heard the name Thorne, and a name like Miller. "Sheriff Miller," Caleb said, the name tasting like copper in his mouth, "and Silas Thorne." He looked at the ground, seeing the faces of those men. He had stood at the bar in the Double Eagle Saloon with Miller. He had sold calves to Thorne 2 springs ago. These were men who went to church on Sunday mornings and spoke of civilization, yet now they were riding out with enough ammunition to slaughter every woman and child in this canyon. "They will start at the old waterholes," Caleb said, looking up at Atsa. "Then they will move to the high grazing lands. If they find my ranch empty, they will use it as a base. It is only a half-day ride from here. If they camp there, they will find the trails leading into these rocks within 2 days." Atsa gripped the hilt of her knife. "Then we ambush them before they reach the house." "No," Caleb said sharply. 30 men with repeating rifles against bows and old muskets? They will cut you to pieces in open ground. We need to know exactly where they are. We need to know if they have supply wagons. If they have a wagon, they are slow. If they are all on horseback, they are fast. I must go look," Caleb said. "You?" Atsa scoffed, though her eyes were wary. "You think you can ride down there and ask them? They will hang you for a traitor before you can say your name." "I know the land better than they do," Caleb countered. "And I need supplies. If we are going to run or fight, we need powder. We need flour. There are things hidden under the floorboards of my tack room that they won't find. But mostly, I need to see their faces. I need to know if they are drunk on whiskey or drunk on hate. There is a difference in how they fight." Atsa studied him for a long moment. The suspicion that always lurked at the back of her gaze was dimmer now, overshadowed by a grudging respect. "You do not go alone," she said. "I didn't expect to," Caleb replied. They left within the hour. Atsa chose 2 other women to ride with them. Connie, the young woman whose horse Caleb had saved on the cliff, and a fierce, quiet tracker named Ilta, who carried a Sharps rifle that was nearly as tall as she was. The ride to the ranch was tense. They stuck to the high ridges, keeping the skyline broken so they wouldn't be silhouetted against the sun. The landscape rolled beneath them, a vast tapestry of sagebrush and ocotillo, beautiful and indifferent to the conflict brewing upon it. As they rode, Atsa brought her horse up beside Caleb's. She kept her eyes on the horizon, but her questions were directed at him. "This Sheriff Miller," she said, "he is a chief?" "In a way," Caleb said. "He is elected. The men of the town choose him to keep the peace." "He keeps the peace by hunting women?" Atsa asked. "He keeps the peace for the people who voted for him," Caleb corrected. "For everyone else. He is just a man with a gun and a license to use it." Atsa fell silent for a mile, the only sound the rhythmic crunch of hooves on gravel. "Tell me about the House of the Bell," she said suddenly. "The church?" Caleb asked, surprised. "Yes, I have seen it from the ridges. A white box with a tower. They ring the bell on the 7th day. Why? To call the people to pray. Caleb said, to speak to God. Does your God have bad ears? Atsa asked. Does he not hear you if you whisper in the canyon? Caleb let out a short, dry laugh. Some might say that. We like to build walls around our God. Atsa. We put him in a box and visit him once a week. It makes us feel like we own him. It makes men like Silas Thorne feel like they can do whatever they want for 6 days, as long as they walk into the box on the 7th. Atsa shook her head. That is a sickness. The spirit is in the wind. It is in the rock. You cannot put the wind in a box. No, Caleb said softly. You can't. They reached the overlook above Caleb's ranch late in the afternoon. The sun was dipping low, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley floor. Caleb signaled for them to dismount and leave the horses in a wash. They crept forward on their stomachs through the sage until they could see the homestead below. Caleb felt a physical blow to his chest as the ranch came into view. It was not a base camp for the soldiers yet. It was a ruin. The front door of the main house was hanging off its hinges, swaying slightly in the breeze. The windows were smashed, dark, jagged holes staring out like empty eye sockets. The corral fence had been pulled down in sections, likely for firewood. Though the surrounding hills were full of timber, it was an act of spite, pure and simple. The yard was churned up by dozens of hoof prints, fresh ones. They were here, Ilta whispered, sighting down her rifle. Yesterday, maybe this morning. They are gone now, Atsa said, pointing to the tracks leading south. They scouted and moved on. They did not stay. Caleb did not speak. He stood up and began to walk down the slope. Wait, Atsa hissed. It could be a trap. It isn't, Caleb said, not breaking stride. They didn't leave anyone behind. There is nothing left to guard. He walked into the yard of the place he had built with his own hands. He stepped over a broken water trough. He saw his good saddle, the one he had bought in Santa Fe, lying in the dirt, the leather slashed to ribbons. He walked up the steps to the porch. The wood creaked under his boots, a familiar sound that now seemed to mourn. He pushed the broken door open and stepped inside. The main room was a wreck. The table was overturned. The flour sack he had left in the pantry had been dragged out and cut open, dusting the floor in white powder like ghostly snow. The tin coffee pot was flattened, stomped by a heavy boot. But it was the bedroom that broke him. Caleb stood in the doorway, his hand gripping the frame until his knuckles turned white. The mattress, the feather bed Sarah had sewn herself, was ripped open. Feathers scattered everywhere. The wardrobe was smashed, and the small wooden crib in the corner, the one he had kept covered with a sheet for 5 years, was overturned. One of the rockers was snapped off. The violence of it was intimate. This wasn't a search for contraband. This was a message. It said, "You are no longer one of us. You are a traitor, and we will erase you." He felt a presence behind him. Atsa stepped into the room. She looked at the destruction, at the feathers drifting in the draft, at the broken crib. She did not speak. She simply stood witness to his exile. Caleb walked over to the corner where a small shelf had hung. It was pulled down. He kicked aside a pile of broken crockery. He was looking for the tin box, the box that held the tin-type picture of Sarah and the lock of the baby's hair. He found the box crushed under the heel of a boot. He pried it open. The picture was gone, likely taken as a souvenir or blown away by the wind. He sank to his knees in the feathers and the flour. A sound escaped his throat, half growl, half sob. He had thought he was already an outcast, living on the edge of town. But this was a violent severing. The world he had been born into had not just rejected him. It had declared war on his memory. Atsa moved quietly around the room. She crouched near the overturned wardrobe. She reached into a crack in the floorboards, where something glinted in the fading light. She stood up and walked to him. She knelt beside him, ignoring the dust. "Caleb," she said softly. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She opened her hand. Lying on her dark palm was a small silver locket. It was tarnished, the chain knotted, but it was whole. It must have slid under the wardrobe when the soldiers were tearing the room apart. "Is this her?" Atsa asked. Caleb reached out with a trembling hand. He took the locket. He pressed the catch. It popped open. Inside was a tiny, hand-painted portrait of Sarah, smiling, her hair caught in the sunlight. He closed his hand around it, pressing it to his chest. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting the tears that threatened to humiliate him. "Yes," he whispered. "That is her." Atsa didn't move away. She stayed kneeling, her shoulder brushing his. She offered no platitudes. She didn't tell him it would be all right. She simply offered her presence as a counterweight to the emptiness of the room. "We will camp here," she said firmly. "Connie and Ilta will watch the ridge. We will eat, and then we will decide." Night fell heavy and dark. They built a small fire in the stone hearth of the ruined house, feeding it with the broken legs of Caleb's chairs. The wind rattled the loose window frames, a lonely, hollow sound. They ate dried venison and hardtack Caleb found in a metal bin that had survived the raid. The two other women took the first watch outside, leaving Caleb and Atsa alone in the firelight. Caleb sat on the floor, his back against the stone of the fireplace. Atsa sat opposite him, her legs crossed, cleaning her rifle with a scrap of oilcloth. "Why did you come back?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence. Caleb looked at her. "To get supplies." "No," Atsa said. She put the rifle down. "I mean, why did you come back to us? When you were on the ridge, you could have ridden south. You know the trails. You could have gone to Mexico. You could have gone to another town where no one knows your name." She looked at him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "You are a free man, Caleb. You are not tied to that log anymore. Why do you dig ditches for Apache women? Why do you risk hanging for people who threw you in a cage?" Caleb turned the locket over and over in his fingers. The metal was warm from his skin. He looked around the shadowed room. He looked at the wreckage of the life he had tried so hard to preserve. "I thought this was home," he said quietly. "For 5 years. I sat in this room and pretended that if I just stayed still enough, I could keep the past alive. I thought if I worked the land, I was honoring them." He looked at Atsa. The firelight danced on her high cheekbones, on the strength of her throat, on the dark depth of her eyes. "But it wasn't a home," he continued. "It was a tomb. I was just the caretaker." He shifted, leaning forward slightly. "When I am in the canyon, when I am hauling water, or fixing the corral, or watching you argue with Naomi, I don't feel like a caretaker. I feel like I'm waking up." Atsa's breath hitched. She went very still. "You are saying we are your home?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of disbelief and fear. "We are the enemy. Caleb, we are the savages who killed your kind." "I don't see savages," Caleb said. He stood up slowly. He crossed the small distance between them and sank down on one knee before her, so they were eye to level. "I see a woman who carries the weight of the world on her back and never bends." He said, "I see a woman who saved my life when she should have let me die." He reached out. This time, he did not stop. He touched her cheek. Her skin was soft, incredibly soft, beneath the dust of the trail. "I stayed because of you, Atsa, because when I look at you, I feel something I thought was dead and buried in the ground." "I feel like I want to live." Atsa made a small, choked sound. She turned her face into his hand, pressing her cheek against his palm. Her eyes slipped shut. "You are a fool," she whispered, but the words were thick with emotion. "A dangerous, stubborn fool." "Maybe," Caleb said. She opened her eyes. They were wet, shining in the firelight. She reached up and gripped the front of his shirt, her fingers tangling in the fabric. She pulled him toward her, not with the gentle tug of a courtship, but with the fierce desperation of someone who has been starving for a lifetime. "Caleb," she breathed. He leaned in. Their foreheads touched, hot skin against hot skin. He could feel her trembling, a fine vibration that ran through her entire body. "If we do this," she whispered against his lips, There is no going back. The tribe, the soldiers, it changes everything. Let it change. Caleb swore. He kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was a collision. It was the taste of salt and smoke and unwashed skin. It was the release of weeks of fear, of grief, of the simmering tension that had built between them on the long rides and the quiet nights. Atsa made a sound low in her throat and wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him down to the floor. Caleb buried his hands in her hair, unraveling the tight braids. His fingers desperate to feel the reality of her, there was no coyness in her, no feigned reluctance. She met him with a hunger that matched his own. She kissed him with the anger of the raids, with the sorrow of her lost brother, with the fierce joy of survival. They fumbled with buttons and ties, their movements frantic, driven by the need to be closer than skin allowed, when they finally came together, on the floor of the ruined house, amidst the scattered feathers of his past life. It felt less like an act of pleasure and more like an act of defiance. They were two broken things fusing together to make something whole. Caleb held her as if she were the only solid thing in a spinning world. He whispered her name into the hollow of her throat, promising her safety, promising her loyalty, promising her everything he had left to give. Atsa clung to him, her nails digging into his shoulders, anchoring herself to his strength. Later, as the fire burned down to embers, they lay tangled together under a shared blanket. The wind still howled outside, but in the circle of their arms, it was quiet. Atsa rested her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. She traced the line of a scar on his arm with her fingertip. "You are mine now," she whispered in Apache. "And you are mine," Caleb answered in English. The dawn came cold and clear, shedding a merciless light on the destruction of the ranch. But Caleb viewed it differently now. It was no longer a tragedy. It was just wood and stone. They dressed in the gray light, moving with a new ease around each other. There was no shame, only a grim sense of purpose. "We cannot leave the house standing," Caleb said as he adjusted his saddle cinch. Atsa looked at the structure. "Why? The soldiers have already looted it. If they come back, they will use it for shelter." Caleb said, "They will sleep in my walls while they hunt you. I won't give them that comfort." He walked to the shed and found a canister of kerosene that had been overlooked. He splashed it across the floorboards of the main room, over the broken furniture, over the scattered feathers. He stood on the porch, a lit match in his hand. He looked at the locket, safe in his pocket, and then at the house. "Goodbye," he whispered. He dropped the match. The dry wood caught instantly. The flames roared up, hungry and bright, devouring the past. Black smoke billowed into the sky, a signal fire that could be seen for miles. Caleb walked back to the horses where Atsa was waiting. She watched the fire, the flames reflecting in her dark eyes. She understood what he was doing. He was burning the bridge. He was cutting the last cord that tied him to the white world. He mounted his horse. He did not look back at the inferno. "Let's go home," he said. They rode back to the canyon in silence, but it was a companionable silence. They rode knee to knee, their horses shoulder to shoulder. When they entered the hidden canyon, the sun was high. The women looked up from their work. They saw the smoke still staining the southern sky. They saw the supplies strapped to the pack mule, but mostly, they saw Caleb and Atsa. They saw the way they rode together. A single unit. They saw the way Caleb reached out to steady Atsa's horse as she dismounted. They saw the look that passed between them, a look of shared secrets and cemented loyalty. A ripple went through the camp. Naomi, standing by the fire, stopped stirring the pot. She looked at them, her eyes narrowing, then widening with realization. A small, sad smile touched her lips. She nodded once, slowly, but others were not so accepting. The woman with the scar stared at them with open hostility, whispering to the woman beside her. Fear flickered in many faces. To bring a white prisoner into the camp was one thing. To take a white lover, that was a violation of the blood. That was inviting the spirits of the dead to scream in anger. Atsa ignored the stares. She walked into the center of the camp, her head high. "The soldiers are coming," she announced, her voice strong. "But we know where they are, and we are ready." Caleb stood beside her, his hand resting near his gun belt. Not as a threat, but as a promise. He felt the eyes of the tribe on him, judging, fearing, wondering. He met their gazes, one by one. He was done apologizing for his existence. He had made his choice. He had burned his life to the ground to stand here. And as he looked at Atsa, standing fierce and beautiful in the center of her people, he knew he would do it again. The heat in the canyon had changed. It was no longer just the oppression of the sun beating against the red walls. It was a physical weight, thick with the scent of dried pine needles and the metallic tang of gun oil. The air held the static charge of a coming storm, though the sky above was a relentless, cloudless blue. Scouts had been coming and going since dawn, their ponies lathered, their faces grim masks of dust and sweat. The news they brought was precise and terrifying. The column of riders was not moving with the slow, blundering noise of a casual patrol. They were moving with purpose. They had spread out, checking the washes, reading the sign, closing the net. Caleb stood by the main fire, which had been smothered to a bed of smokeless coals. He watched the women of the tribe move. The paralysis of fear that had gripped them days ago was gone, replaced by a cold, frantic efficiency. They were no longer victims waiting for the slaughter. They were soldiers preparing for a siege. "We must move the children," Atsa said, appearing at his elbow. Her voice was tight, her eyes scanning the cliffs. Caleb nodded, pointing toward a series of fissures high up on the western wall. "The caves near the raven roosts. The path is narrow. A horse cannot climb it, and a man cannot climb it if there is someone at the top with a rock. It is a good place," Atsa agreed. She turned and shouted orders in Apache. The scene that followed was heartbreaking in its quietness. Mothers did not weep as they handed their small children to the grandmothers. They pressed faces into hair, whispered fierce, quick promises, and then pushed them toward the trail. The children, sensing the terror of their mothers, went silent, climbing the steep rock face like little goats, disappearing into the shadows of the earth. Caleb turned away, his throat tight. He walked to the edge of the camp where Naomi was overseeing the distribution of ammunition. They did not have much. A few boxes of cartridges for the Winchesters, a bag of black powder for the muzzle loaders, and a pile of arrows that the older men had been fletching for days. He picked up a repeating rifle, checking the action. It was smooth, well-oiled. "They will come from the South Wash," Caleb said to Naomi. "It is the only way to bring a wagon in, and if they plan to stay, they have a wagon." Naomi looked at him. Her face was calm, but her hands trembled slightly as she counted bullets. "And if they do not bring a wagon, if they ride straight in, then we hold them at the Narrows," Caleb said. "The canyon necks down to 20 feet across just past the old ironwood tree. We can pile rocks there, make them fight for every inch." As the afternoon wore on, a new tension began to simmer in the camp, one that had nothing to do with the approaching enemy. A group of younger women, led by the fierce, scarred woman named Bi, had gathered near the corral. They were painting their faces with black ash and red clay. They were checking the cinches on their fastest horses. Caleb watched them, unease prickling the back of his neck. He walked over to where Atsa was sharpening her knife on a whetstone. "What are they doing?" he asked. Atsa did not look up. "They want to ride tonight. They want to hit the ranchers while they sleep." "That is suicide," Caleb said, his voice rising. "It is war," Atsa snapped. She stood up, sliding the knife into her sheath. "They argue that if we wait here like rabbits in a hole, we die. They say we should strike them with terror, burn their wagons, stampede their horses, make them afraid of the dark again." "They are 30 men," Caleb said, gripping her arm. 30 men who are looking for an excuse to kill everything that moves. If Bia rides down there with 5 women, they won't just be killed. They will be tortured, and it will bring the rest of them down on us faster than we can prepare." Atsa pulled her arm away. "Do you think I do not know this?" but I cannot command their rage. Caleb, they have lost husbands. They have lost sons. They want blood for blood. You have to stop them, Caleb said. I am trying, Atsa hissed. But they look at me, and they see a woman who sleeps with the enemy. They wonder if my heart has turned white. The accusation hung in the air between them. Caleb stepped back, feeling the sting of it. Is that what you think? He asked quietly. Atsa looked at him. Her eyes were tormented, torn between the logic of survival and the burning need for vengeance that was the birthright of her people. I think you want us to live, she said. But I think you do not understand the fire that burns in Bia's belly. You fight to survive, Caleb. She fights because she has nothing left to lose. This is not about anger, Caleb insisted. It is about numbers. It is about terrain. If you attack them on the open plain, you lose. If you make them come into the rocks, where you know every shadow and every foothold, you win. It is that simple. Don't let them throw their lives away on a raid that changes nothing. Atsa stared at him for a long moment. Then she turned and walked toward the group of women. Caleb could not hear the words, but he saw the gestures. He saw Atsa pointing at the cliffs, at the children hiding in the caves, her voice rising in a sharp, authoritative cadence. He saw Bia shouting back, pointing at the southern horizon. Naomi moved to stand beside Caleb. It is a hard thing, she murmured, to tell a hawk to sit still when it sees the snake. They aren't hawks. Naomi, Caleb said grimly. They are the prey, and the snake is big. The argument seemed to end in a stalemate. Bia turned away, spitting on the ground, but she did not mount her horse. The group dispersed, sullen and angry. Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But the peace was fragile. Later, in the privacy of their shelter, the conflict flared again. The sun had set, and the canyon was plunged into a deep, purple twilight. Caleb was cleaning his revolver by the light of a tallow candle. Atsa sat across from him. She was restless, her hands constantly moving, braiding a piece of grass, smoothing her skirt, touching the handle of her knife. You shamed them, she said softly. I saved them, Caleb replied without looking up. You made them feel weak, Atsa said. She leaned forward, her eyes catching the candlelight. You speak of strategy, you speak of terrain, but they speak of honor. Is it better to die fighting in the open, screaming your name, than to die huddled behind a rock like a trapped rat? Is it better to die? Caleb slammed the revolver down on the blanket. Is that the choice? Because I thought the point was to live. I thought the point was to see the sun come up tomorrow. Atsa flinched at his tone, but she did not back down. And what kind of life is it? Caleb, hiding, running, waiting for the next white man to decide he wants our land? It is life, Caleb said, his voice breaking. It is breathing. It is holding each other in the dark. He crawled over to her, grabbing her hands. His grip was hard, desperate. I don't want you to be a martyr. Atsa, I don't want a song about how brave you were when you died. I want you here, warm, alive. Atsa looked at him, her defenses crumbling. The rage drained out of her, leaving only a stark, naked fear. I'm afraid, she whispered. I know, Caleb said. I am too. They held each other then, rocking back and forth in the dim light. It was not a romantic embrace. It was two people clinging to the wreckage in a storm. They argued not because they disagreed on the end, but because the path to get there was paved with impossible choices. But the choice was taken from them before the moon rose. A sound shattered the quiet of the night, the thunder of hooves approaching fast up the canyon floor. Caleb and Atsa scrambled out of the shelter, weapons in hand. 3 horses galloped into the firelight. They were ridden by young women, Bia's followers, but Bia was not with them. The lead rider, a girl no older than 16, slid from her horse. She was laughing, a high, hysterical sound, waving a sack of flour over her head. We did it, she shouted. We found the wagon. We took the food. Caleb ran to the horse. He saw the sweat, the foam on the animal's neck. He grabbed the bridle. Where is Bea? He demanded. The girl's smile faltered. She stayed back, to cover our tracks. She said she would lead them to the West Wash. Caleb looked at the sack of flour. He looked at the ammunition belt the girl had draped over her shoulder. Then he looked at the ground. The dust in the canyon was soft. The moon was bright. "You rode straight back?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. The girl nodded, confused by his anger. "We rode fast. We brought the supplies." "You brought a road map," Caleb said. He released the bridle and turned to Atsa. "Look at the ground." Atsa looked. The tracks were deep, churning up the earth. In the moonlight, they were a visible scar leading straight from the canyon mouth to the heart of the village. "They will not need scouts now," Caleb said, his voice hollow. "They will just follow the trail. They will be here by sunrise." A silence descended on the camp, heavier than the heat had been. The victory of the raid turned to ash in their mouths. Bia might have bought them an hour by decoying the soldiers, but the tracks of the returning horses had signed their death warrant. "We have to fight," Atsa said. Her voice was steady now. The indecision was gone. "There is one chance," Caleb said. He walked to his horse, which was picketed near the trees. He began to saddle it. "What are you doing?" Atsa asked, following him. "I am going to talk to them," Caleb said. "You cannot," Atsa said, grabbing his arm. "They will kill you on sight." "Maybe," Caleb said. He tightened the cinch with a savage jerk. "But I know these men. I know Silas Thorne. I know Sheriff Miller. They are angry, but they are not soldiers. They are businessmen. They want land, they want cattle, and they want to feel safe. They don't want to die in a rock slide for $50 a month." He turned to her. "I can offer them a way out. I can tell them the canyon is empty. I can tell them you moved north. They will see the tracks," Atsa cried. "I will tell them the tracks were a trick," Caleb said. "I will tell them I led the women out the back way." "And why would they believe you?" Atsa asked. "You are the traitor." "Because I will go to them unarmed," Caleb said. Under a white flag, he took a white cotton shirt from his saddlebag, one of the last remnants of his old life, and tied it to the barrel of his rifle. Then he shoved the rifle into the scabbard, deep, so the stock was hidden, leaving only the white cloth fluttering in the night breeze. "If I don't come back," Caleb said, looking at her, "you blow the rock slide at the Narrows the moment the first horse passes the ironwood tree. Do not wait. Do not hesitate. Bury them." Atsa looked at him. She reached up and touched his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "Come back," she whispered. Caleb mounted his horse. He looked down at her one last time, memorizing the line of her nose, the depth of her eyes. Then he turned the horse and rode out of the canyon, following the tracks of the raiders back toward the enemy. He met them 2 miles south, near the dry riverbed that marked the boundary of the flatlands. The sun was just beginning to bleed over the horizon, casting long, grotesque shadows. The enemy camp was already awake. They were in the saddle, forming a column. When they saw him, a lone rider with a white flag, a ripple of movement went through the line. Rifles were raised. "Hold your fire!" a voice shouted. Caleb rode closer. He stopped 50 yards away. He kept his hands high, away from his waist. The group of men separated. 3 riders moved forward. One was Sheriff Miller, a heavy-set man with a tin star pinned to a dusty vest. One was a lieutenant in a blue uniform, looking tired and irritable. And the third was Silas Thorne. Thorne looked at Caleb with a mixture of disbelief and sneering contempt. "Well, I will be damned," Thorne said, spitting tobacco juice onto the sand, the ghost of Caleb Walker. "We thought you were dead, boy, or skinned." "I am alive," Caleb said. His voice was steady, though his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "You look like an Indian," Miller said, eyeing Caleb's long hair and the buckskin leggings he now wore. "You smell like one, too." "I have come to talk," Caleb said. "Not to trade insults." "Talk?" Thorne laughed. "There is no talk. Walker, you are standing in the way of the law. You are harboring hostiles, thieves, murderers. They are women," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the laughter. "Women and children. There are no warriors in that canyon. Silas, just widows trying to survive." "Don't give me that," the lieutenant snapped. They raided our supply wagon last night. They wounded one of my men. Because you are hunting them." Caleb shot back. "You push a wolf into a corner. It bites." He looked at Miller. "Sheriff, listen to me. There is nothing up there for you. No gold, no vast herds of cattle, just rocks and hungry people. If you ride into that canyon, you are going to lose men. Good men. Men from town who have families waiting for them. Is that a threat?" Thorne asked, his hand drifting to his pistol. "It is a fact," Caleb said. "The terrain is a killing box. I know it. You know it. Turn around. Go back to town. Tell them you found nothing. Leave them be." "And what do you get out of this?" Thorne sneered. "A warm squaw in your bed? Is that it? Caleb? You sold your soul for a savage?" Caleb felt a flash of white-hot anger, but he pushed it down. "I found a life. Silas," he said cold and hard, "which is more than I ever found drinking in your saloon. I found people who treat me better than my own neighbors did when my wife died." The mention of his wife made Miller look away, uncomfortable, but Thorne's face hardened. "You are a traitor." "Walker," Thorne said, "you are a disgrace to your race. The lieutenant here says if you lead us to them, if you show us the way in, we might let you ride away. Maybe just a few years in prison instead of a hanging." Caleb looked at the lieutenant. "Is that the offer? Betray them. And I live?" The lieutenant nodded. "We want the ringleaders, the tall woman, and the one who raided the wagon. Give us them, and we leave the rest." Caleb looked at the line of men. He saw the hunger in their eyes. He knew that offer was a lie. If he led them in, they would slaughter everyone. "No," Caleb said. Thorne's eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" "I said no," Caleb shouted, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I will not lead you to them, and if you ride past this riverbed, you will pay for it in blood. You talk about them being savages. I remember who shot down the peaceful camp at Warm Springs. I remember who poisoned the water holes. You are the savages, Thorne, and I am done with you." He yanked the reins, turning his horse. "Take him," Thorne shouted. Caleb kicked his horse into a gallop, leaning low over the neck. He heard the crack of a rifle. Thorne had fired. The bullet whistled past Caleb's ear, close enough to snap the air like a whip. He expected the second shot to tear into his back. He braced himself for the impact. Crack! A gunshot rang out, but it did not come from behind him. It came from the cliffs above. Silas Thorne's horse screamed and reared, a splash of red appearing on its neck. Thorne was thrown from the saddle, landing hard in the sand. "Sniper!" the lieutenant screamed. "Take cover!" Bullets began to rain down from the high rocks. Ilta. She had followed him. She had been watching. Caleb didn't look back. He drove his heels into his horse's flanks, racing for the shelter of the canyon mouth. The air around him buzzed with lead, but the soldiers were too busy scrambling for cover to aim true. He made the turn into the narrows, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was alive, but the truce, if there ever was one, was shattered. The enemy knew exactly where he stood. When he rode into the camp, the silence was absolute. The women were at their positions. They had heard the shooting. Caleb slid from his horse. His legs nearly gave way. Atsa was there, catching him. "You are hit?" she asked, her hands frantically searching his body for blood. "No," Caleb gasped. "I am whole." He looked at her. His eyes were wild, filled with the adrenaline of the escape and the horror of the confrontation. "They are coming," he said. "They are angry, and they know I am with you. There is no going back for me. Atsa, I burned the bridge." Atsa pulled him close. She held him tightly, her face pressed into his dusty shirt. "Good," she whispered fiercely. "Good." The wait began. The sun climbed higher, turning the canyon into a furnace. The enemy did not attack immediately. They were regrouping, cautious now that they knew the cliffs had teeth. Caleb and Atsa sat in the shade of a large boulder near the narrows, sharing a canteen of warm water. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a heavy, aching exhaustion. Caleb looked at the red rock walls. He thought of the town he would never see again. He thought of the grave of his wife and child, miles away, abandoned. Do you think about the valley? Atsa asked softly. Caleb looked at her. The hidden valley? Yes, the grass. The water, the quiet. I think about it, Caleb said. If we live through tomorrow, Atsa said, tracing a pattern in the dust with her finger, we should go there. Not just to hide cattle, but to live. We could build a cabin, a real one, with windows. And a garden? Caleb asked, a small smile touching his lips. Corn, Atsa said, and squash, and maybe a rocking chair. Caleb laughed, a dry, rasping sound. A rocking chair for an Apache warrior. Atsa shrugged, her eyes soft. Even warriors get tired. Caleb, she leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her, pulling her close. In the shadow of the coming battle, in the face of 30 guns and a world that wanted them dead, they built a fragile, beautiful dream. It was a house made of words, but it was strong enough to hold them. As night fell, the air grew cold. The stars came out, brilliant and indifferent, just as they had been on the night Caleb was captured. The women were at their posts. The rock slides were rigged, great piles of boulders held back by single logs, ready to be cut loose. The riflemen were positioned in the crevices. Caleb and Atsa stood near the trigger of the largest slide. They checked the ropes one last time. It will happen at dawn, Caleb said quietly. They will want the light to shoot. Atsa nodded. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers laced with his. He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. They stood there in the dark, an American rancher and an Apache leader, united by a love that defied every law of their land. They were terrified. They were exhausted, but as they looked toward the mouth of the canyon, waiting for the first sound of a hoof on stone, they were not alone. And that made all the difference. The dawn did not break with the golden promise of a new day. It arrived as a pale, steel-gray light that filtered slowly into the deep throat of the canyon. The air was cold, biting at the skin, and utterly silent. There were no birds singing this morning. The very earth seemed to be holding its breath. Caleb Walker lay prone on a limestone ledge 30 feet above the canyon floor. His body pressed flat against the cool rock. The barrel of his Winchester rested on a folded blanket to muffle any sound of movement. Beside him, Atsa crouched, her bow strung, a quiver of arrows resting easily at her hip. She did not look at him, but he could feel the tension radiating from her body like heat from a dying coal. "They are close," she whispered, not moving her lips. "I know," Caleb breathed back. He could hear them now. It was a sound he knew well, the jingle of bit chains, the creak of saddle leather, the heavy, rhythmic thud of iron-shod hooves on the hardpan. It was the sound of confident men, men who believed they were riding toward a massacre of helpless women, not a war. Down in the Narrows, where the canyon walls pinched in until they were barely wide enough for 2 riders to pass abreast, the trap was set. A massive pile of brush and debris had been arranged to look like a natural blockage. But behind it, the strongest women of the tribe waited with long spears and hatred in their hearts. Above, on both rims. The rest of the tribe waited behind boulders that had been loosened from the earth, held back by ropes and sheer willpower. The first rider came into view around the bend of the ironwood tree. It was Silas Thorne. He rode tall in the saddle, a cigar clamped between his teeth, his rifle resting lazily across his pommel. Behind him rode Sheriff Miller, and then the blue uniforms of the soldiers, a long, snaking line of 30 men squeezed into the bottleneck. They looked bored. They looked arrogant. Caleb sighted down the barrel of his rifle. He aimed not at Thorne, but at a rock just in front of the lead horse's hooves. He did not want to start the killing yet. He wanted them deep in the box. "Wait!" Atsa hissed, sensing his finger tighten on the trigger. Let the tail of the snake enter the hole. The column moved forward. The horses pinned their ears back, smelling the lingering scent of the Apache camp, smelling the fear and the old smoke. But the men spurred them on. When the last soldier, a young private who looked no older than 18, passed the twisted trunk of the ironwood, Atsa rose to her knees. She did not shout. She simply raised her arm and brought it down in a chopping motion. On the opposite rim, Naomi cut a rope with a single slash of her knife. The sound was not an explosion, but a grinding roar that seemed to come from the center of the earth. Tons of red sandstone, loosened by levers and gravity, detached from the cliff face behind the soldiers. The rocks crashed down into the narrow pass, sealing the exit in a choking cloud of red dust. The trap snapped shut. Panic erupted instantly. The horses screamed, rearing and plunging in the confined space. Men shouted orders that were lost in the chaos. "Now!" Atsa cried. She drew her bow and loosed an arrow in one fluid motion. It struck a rancher in the shoulder, knocking him from his saddle. Caleb fired. His bullet struck the sand near Thorn's horse, sending the animal into a frenzy that threw Thorn into the dirt. Suddenly, the canyon rim was alive. Arrows rained down like angry wasps. The ancient muzzle loaders of the older women barked, sending clouds of white smoke drifting over the ledge. Down below, the soldiers tried to form a firing line, but there was no cover. They were exposed, clustered together, panicked targets in a shooting gallery. They fired blindly up at the cliffs, their bullets chipping harmlessly against the stone. Caleb worked the lever of his rifle with a grim, mechanical rhythm. Crack, eject, load, crack. He saw faces he recognized through the dust. There was the blacksmith from town, trying to control his terrified mule. There was a man he had played cards with 2 winters ago, now clutching a shattered arm. Caleb gritted his teeth, a sour taste flooding his mouth. He did not shoot to kill if he could help it. He shot to wound. He shot to disable horses. He shot to terrify. But he shot. He had chosen his side. And there was no middle ground in the narrows. B, the scarred woman, was fighting like a demon near the blockage. She stood atop a rock, firing a captured pistol, screaming insults at the men who had killed her brother. The battle was brutal and loud. The dust rose in choking waves, mixing with the sharp, acrid sting of gunpowder. The screams of men and horses bounced off the canyon walls, amplifying the horror until it sounded like the gates of hell had opened. The lieutenant, the officer who had demanded Caleb's betrayal the day before, managed to rally a small group of soldiers. To the wall, he screamed, pointing his saber at the western overhang. Climb! He was trying to lead a charge up a narrow scree slope, hoping to flank the women. Caleb saw the movement. He swung his rifle, but his magazine was empty. He cursed, fumbling for cartridges in his belt. Atsa saw it too. She abandoned her cover, leaping onto a lower rock to get a clear shot at the officer. She drew her bow, the wood creaking with the tension. But the lieutenant saw her. He saw the tall woman with the braid, the leader he had been told to hunt. He stopped climbing. He raised his heavy Colt revolver, steadying it with 2 hands. He was less than 50 feet away. He could not miss. "Atsa!" Caleb roared. She did not hear him over the din. She was focused on her aim. Her eye narrowed, her fingers releasing the string. The lieutenant fired. In that fraction of a second, time seemed to warp for Caleb. He did not think. He did not weigh the options. He simply moved. He threw himself from his position, lunging across the small gap between the rocks, placing his body between the gun and the woman he loved. The impact hit him like a sledgehammer. It was not a sharp pain at first. It was a massive, dull thud that punched the air from his lungs and spun him around. He felt his feet leave the ground, and then the hard slam of the rock against his back as he fell. The world went instantly gray. The sound of the battle receded, sounding like it was coming from underwater. "Caleb?" The voice was frantic. He felt hands on him, warm, slippery hands. Caleb looked up. He saw Atsa's face hovering above him. She was screaming, but he couldn't hear the words. He saw a look of absolute, shattering terror in her eyes, a look he had never seen in the fierce warrior who led this tribe. He tried to speak, to tell her he was all right, but when he opened his mouth, only a wet cough came out, tasting of copper. He saw Atsa turn back to the canyon floor. The terror in her eyes vanished, replaced by a rage so pure and white-hot it seemed to scorch the air. She stood up, exposing herself fully to the enemy fire. She let out a cry that was not human, It was the shriek of a wounded mountain lion, a sound of grief and fury that froze the blood. She grabbed Caleb's fallen rifle. She didn't bother to aim. She worked the lever and fired, screaming with every shot, driving the soldiers back by the sheer force of her will, inspired by her fury. The other women surged forward. Rocks rained down with renewed intensity. The arrows flew thicker. The enemy broke. They were not soldiers anymore. They were frightened men trapped in a box with a demon. The lieutenant was down with an arrow in his leg. Silas Thorne was scrambling over the rock pile, abandoning his horse, running for his life. "Retreat!" someone screamed. "Get back!" The soldiers dropped their weapons. They scrambled over the dead horses and the debris, clawing their way back toward the open desert, desperate to escape the slaughterhouse of the canyon. Within minutes, the firing stopped. The only sounds left were the groans of the wounded and the settling of the dust. Atsa dropped the rifle. She fell to her knees beside Caleb. "Do not go," she whispered, her hands pressing hard against the hole in his chest. Her voice broke into a sob. "You are not allowed to leave me. Not now. Do you hear me? Caleb Walker?" Caleb looked at the sky. It was a brilliant, blinding blue. He felt cold, so very cold. "The valley," he murmured, the words slurring. We have to plant the corn." Then the darkness took him. The days that followed were a blur of heat and shadow. Caleb existed in a fever dream, floating on a river of fire. He saw Sarah's face, but she was smiling and waving him away. He saw the soldiers, but they turned into smoke. And through it all, there was a constant presence. A cool hand on his forehead, a voice singing soft, rhythmic songs that anchored him to the earth, water trickling between his cracked lips. He would wake for moments, lucid but weak as a kitten. He would see the soot-stained canvas of a wickiup. He would see Atsa sleeping sitting up, her head resting against the pole, her hand holding his. He called her name in the dark. He murmured about the green grass of the hidden valley. He promised her safety. He promised her a rocking chair. The fever broke on the fourth night. Caleb woke, his shirt soaked in sweat, but his mind clear. The pain in his chest was a sharp, focused agony now, not a consuming fire. Atsa was there. She was awake, watching him by the light of a small fire. Her face was gaunt, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "You stayed," she whispered, reaching out to touch his cheek. "I had to," Caleb rasped. His voice was a wreck. "I promised you a garden." Atsa smiled, and tears spilled down her cheeks, tracking through the dust. During his recovery, the mood in the camp shifted. The victory at the Narrows had been decisive, but it had come at a cost. 3 women had died. Many were wounded, and they knew the truth. The army would return. Next time, they would bring cannons. Next time, they would not come into the box. The ranchers who had been captured, 5 of them, including the blacksmith, were held in a small cave. Bee and the younger women wanted to execute them. They wanted to hang them from the cottonwoods as a warning. But Naomi stood in the center of the camp, leaning on her staff. "We are not them," she said, her voice cutting through the anger. "If we kill them in cold blood, we become what they say we are. We become the monsters. We have defended our home. That is enough." She looked at Atsa, who sat cleaning Caleb's blood from her knife. "What says the war leader?" Naomi asked. Atsa looked at the prisoners. She looked at the fresh graves of her sisters. Then she looked at the wickiup where Caleb lay healing, the white man who had taken a bullet for her. "Let them go," Atsa said quietly. "Take their horses, take their guns, taking their boots. Let them walk back to town barefoot across the cactus. Let them tell the others that the Apache women gave them their lives. That is a heavier burden than death." And so, the prisoners were released. They stumbled out of the canyon, shamed and broken, carrying a story that would change the way the territory spoke of the women's tribe. 2 weeks later, the exodus began. They could not stay in the canyon. It was a known place now, a place of death. The decision had been made to move to the hidden valley, the sanctuary Caleb had shown them. It was high, It was remote, and it was defendable. It was a slow procession. The women drove the cattle and the spare horses. The travois carried the supplies and the wounded. Caleb rode in the center of the column. He was pale, leaning heavily on the pommel of his saddle, his chest bound tight with linen strips, but he was upright. Atsa rode beside him, their knees touching. She checked on him every few minutes, her eyes scanning his face for signs of pain. "I am fine," Caleb said, catching her look. "I am not glass." "Atsa, you are cracked glass," she retorted, though her voice was fond. "If you break again, I cannot fix you." The journey was hard. They climbed the goat trails, winding higher into the mountains. But as they crested the final ridge and looked down into the hidden valley, a collective sigh seemed to ripple through the tribe. The grass was emerald green. The creek sparkled in the sun. It looked like a painting of paradise. "It is a good place," Naomi said, riding up beside them. "A place to start again." They descended into the valley, not as refugees but as settlers. The months that followed were a time of building. The sound of gunshots was replaced by the sound of axes and hammers. They built substantial wickiups, reinforced with mud and timber against the coming winter. Caleb showed them how to fell the straighter pines to build a sturdy corral for the cattle. In the evenings, the cultural exchange began in earnest. By the fire, Caleb taught the younger women the secrets of cattle breeding, how to spot a good calf, how to treat rotfoot. In return, they taught him. He learned the language of the land. He learned that the wind from the north had a name, and the wind from the south had another. He learned the prayers for the deer and the songs for the corn. He was no longer the outsider. The children, who had once thrown stones at him, now followed him around like ducklings. They called him Shetso, grandfather, or simply Caleb. He carved them wooden horses. He showed them how to tie the diamond knot. He was woven into the fabric of the tribe, a thread of wool in a basket of yucca. One evening, as autumn began to paint the leaves of the cottonwoods in gold, the tribe gathered for a feast. They had traded some of the cattle with a friendly band of Navajo for corn and peaches. The fire was large, sending sparks dancing up toward the Milky Way. Naomi stood up. The chatter died down. She spoke in Apache first, then in English for Caleb's benefit. "We have walked a long road," she said. "We have walked through blood and hunger. We have lost much, but we have found something too." She gestured to Caleb, who was sitting near the fire, whittling a piece of ash wood. "A stranger came to us," Naomi said, "a man of the enemy. We put a rope on his leg. We called him Spy. But the heart is not judged by the skin. The heart is judged by what it bleeds for." She looked at the women. "This man bled for us. He burned his own house for us. He gave us this valley. He is no longer Inda. He is Nd. He is Apache." A murmur of agreement went around the circle. It was a formal adoption, a rewriting of his soul in the eyes of the tribe. Atsa stood up then. She wore a new dress of soft buckskin, beaded with the patterns of her family. She walked over to Caleb and held out her hand. Caleb put down his knife. He took her hand and stood up, wincing slightly as the scar on his chest pulled tight. He stood beside her, towering over her. Yet she seemed the taller of the two. "He is my heart," Atsa said simply to the tribe. "He is the father of the children we will have. He is the wall that stands between us and the wind." She looked up at him, her eyes fierce and shining. "And I am his." Caleb looked at the faces around the fire. He saw Bia, who nodded at him with respect. He saw the children. He saw Naomi. "I am yours," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "Until the last star falls." The women cheered. It was a sound of pure joy, a sound that had been missing from their lives for too long. In that moment, surrounded by the people who had once been his captors, Caleb Walker knew he was richer than any rancher in the territory. He had won every woman's heart, not by conquering them, but by letting them conquer his loneliness. Later that night, Caleb and Atsa walked away from the dying fire. They walked to the edge of the meadow, where the valley floor dropped away into the darkness of the lower canyons. The wind moved through the tall grass with a soft, hushing sound. The cattle lowed in the distance, a comforting, domestic rumble. Caleb put his arm around Atsa's waist, pulling her back against his chest. She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder. "It is quiet," she said. "It is peace," Caleb answered. He looked out at the vast, star-strewn sky. He thought of the empty, silent man he had been a year ago, a man waiting to die in a dusty house, and he felt the warmth of the woman in his arms, the beat of her heart against his ribs. "We will have to build that cabin soon," he said softly, "before the snow flies." Atsa laughed, a low, throaty sound. "And the rocking chair?" "And the rocking chair," Caleb promised. "I want a daughter first," Atsa said, turning in his arms to face him. "A girl with eyes like yours, but a spirit like mine. God help the world then." Caleb smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. He kissed her. It was slow and deep, a kiss that tasted of the future. It was a vow made in the silence of the high country, a promise that no matter what came next, no matter if the soldiers returned, or the winter was hard, or the world tried to tear them apart, they would stand. They stood together on the edge of the wild, two survivors who had found a way to bloom in the desert, and as the moon rose over the rim of their valley, it shone down on a love that was as enduring and as dangerous as the West itself. Thank you for listening to this story, captured by an Apache women's tribe. The lonely rancher won every woman's heart. It has been a journey through the dust and the heartache of the old frontier, and I hope you felt every moment of it. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below and tell me which part of the world you call home. And if this story moved you, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more tales of love, survival, and the untamed American spirit. Share your thoughts in English. I read every one of them. Until next time, keep your fires burning bright.